I will begin this afternoon with a quote. The quote says, "For my people everywhere, singing their slave songs repeatedly, their dirges and their ditties, their blues and jubilees, praying their prayers nightly to an unknown God, bending their knees humbly to an unseen power." This is the opening stanza in Margaret Walker's famous poem, "For My People." Originally published in 1942, Walker uses imagery and metaphor to personify who her people are. In fact, throughout the poem, Walker classifies her people as those who sing songs of sorrow and jubilee, who bend their knees to an unseen power, who live on 47th in Chicago and on Lenox in New York. She continues, describing her people as an enslaved people, a confused people, an emotionally broken people, but also a deeply religious people, a faith-filled people, a determined people, a people not simply overcome by sorrow, but filled with much joy and laughter. These people, Walker bemoans at the end of her poem to, quote, "Let a people of loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and a strength of final clenching be the pulsing in our spirits and our bloods. Let a race of men now rise and take control." This woman is clearly calling for a revolution. She's not simply creating some kind of artistic prose of poetry. No, she is calling for a revolution that shifts the socio-political tide from that of destruction, death, and extermination to that of life, liberty, and freedom. Margaret Walker is not the first black woman to call for a revolution of such tide-shifting proportions. In fact, black women have been the hands, the backbone, the feet, and yea, even the brains of our social movements. I mean, there's no emancipation without Harriet. There's no civil rights without Rosa. And black lives would continue to not matter without Patrisse Cullors, Elisa Garza, and Opal Tometi. Black women have always been at the heart of not just our calls for revolution, but they have been the fuel maintaining them. And it's this reality of black women's central involvement in our past and present social justice movements that has me wondering, church, why does the black church continue to promote activism, continue to project the work of social justice as a prophetic anointing reserved exclusively for those anatomically classified as male? Why does the black church celebrate the activism of Dr. Martin Luther King with no mention of Diane Nash? Why does the black church celebrate the activism of Nelson Mandela with no mention of Miriam Makeba? Why does the black church celebrate the activism of Reverend Jesse Jackson with no mention of Shirley Chisholm? See, I believe one of the reasons why we have a tendency to celebrate the activism of black men to the neglect of black women is because our social justice theology is exclusively based on the activism of men in the Bible. See, every social justice sermon you hear is either on Moses the emancipator, Nehemiah the weeping prophet, Micah the justice expositor, or Paul and Silas the great liberators. The patriarchal, misogynist lens through which we read social justice in the Bible has erased the female activists of Scripture and delivered the message that activism is best enacted by men. We have inadvertently told our girls that it's okay to support a man's social justice vision, but it's not okay to have your own. We've taught our daughters that it's okay to be the sounding board to a man's prophetic voice, but it's inappropriate for you to develop your own. By separating the women of the Bible from their engagement in the social justice issues of their time, we have invariably taught our girls that it is normal, yea, honorable, to be hidden in a man's shadow. It's normal, yea, honorable, to work for freedom, to fight and sacrifice for equality, to die for justice, and to be forgotten. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe these men did phenomenal work. And without their example, we would be lost in trying to figure out how to do this thing called social justice. But today is the day that we celebrate the history of protest and persuasion as demonstrated by powerful Black women. This is significant because if we're honest, many of the contributions of Black women remain unchronicled, our sacrifices continue to go unacknowledged, and our strategic ability repeatedly goes unappreciated. How is it, saints, that mothers like Georgia Gilmore could feed the leaders and fundraise for the boycotts and yet go unacknowledged for sustaining them? How is it that grandmothers like Prathia Hall could out-preach the leaders and yet go unacknowledged for motivating them? How is it that sisters like Anna Lee Williams could sing for the leaders and yet go unacknowledged for inspiring them? How is it that sisters like Diane Nash could create political strategy for the leaders and yet go unacknowledged for equipping them? We have a history of allowing Black women to work and sacrifice and remain unacknowledged, unappreciated, unprotected. See, the truth is, such intentional erasure of Black women from our communal narrative of justice and activism is steeped in a long history of sexism. In fact, Margaret Walker said in 1979, quote, "Even in pre-Civil War days, Black women stood in the vanguard for equal justice, for freedom from slavery, for recognition of women as citizens and co-partners with men in all of life's endeavors. However, because of the nature of American history, and particularly because of the institutions of slavery and segregation, the names and lives of Black women leaders are all but unknown in American society." Scholars like Bernice McNair Barnett surmise this practice is because, quote, "although they have traditionally performed crucial roles and have been considered the backbone in the church, Black women historically have not been allowed the opportunity to become ministers, deacons, or trustees, the heads and top decision makers in the male-dominated hierarchy of the Black Baptist Church," end quote. This lack of willingness to give women legitimized and coveted positions of power influences our inability to acknowledge certain gifts and capabilities within them, let alone the contributions they have made to our churches and communities. And to be clear, this is not a problem that is exclusive to the Black Baptist Church. We know firsthand what it means for a Chinese female minister to pastor the largest SDA church in the world and yet be refused ordination. We know firsthand what it means for female ministers to be granted seminary training and never offered pastoral positions. We know firsthand what it means for women in general and women of color in particular to be denied the opportunity to function in critical positions of power with the proper backing and authority. This is not a Black Baptist Church issue, an AME Zion issue. This is a church issue. Womanist theologian Jacqueline Grant posits that there has been a misunderstanding surrounding the complement backbone. See, while Black women have taken it to mean that we are a sturdy skeletal structure keeping every single aspect of protest programming in operation, it seems as though the men who reference the term actually mean that Black women are simply to be in the background. They use the term as a reference to location rather than function. And what that means is that Black women should just be kept in their place. But see, the truth of the matter is, had it not been for the courage of black women, the protests of black women, as a people, we'd still been sold to destruction, death, and extermination. Our freedoms, our prophetic voice, our political strategy, our inspiration, and our sustenance, we owe to a host of black women who woke up every morning and said, "For my people." This justice anthem first rang out in 478 BC during the reign of Persian king Ahasuerus, ruler of 127 provinces from India to Kush. Queen Esther, who had just been promoted from the king's harem to now queen of all Persia, is made aware that the Jews are facing a threat of genocide for no other reason than their nationality and culture. Her cousin Mordecai comes to her and says, "Don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your family will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Realizing that her people are victims of targeted, systematic, and institutional extermination, Queen Esther must learn quickly that her economic status cannot save her. See, she has to learn that marrying a rich Persian man can't save her, that earning a Persian degree can't save her, that having Persian friends can't save her, that living in the most respected Persian house cannot save her, that no matter what she does, who she associates with, and what she puts on to assimilate to the surrounding Persian culture, no matter what she does, Esther is a Jew. She is susceptible to this decree. She must learn quickly that the fact of the matter is that injustice against any Jew is a threat to justice for every Jew. See, if Dr. Martin Luther King were writing during Esther's lifetime, I believe Mordecai would have quoted him in their dialogue. I believe that he would have come to her trying to get her to understand her susceptibility to the decree and thus her own inability to avoid the consequences of it. I hear him telling her, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." And I believe that this is a truth that many of us have failed to see in 2020. See, as we all know in Scripture, the Jews were made up of 12 tribes in Israel. These tribes are named after the 12 sons of Isaac, right? So, what we have is when Moses liberates the Hebrews out of Egypt, millions of Jews are following him, but they are dispersed into 12 different tribes. The Bible teaches us that Esther was belonging to the tribe of Benjamin, all right? So just like the Jews, Africans are a large and dispersed people who occupy many lands and are a part of many tribes. There are Africans on every continent and in almost every country. In fact, according to Harvard's African Languages program, the continent of Africa is one of the most linguistically diverse continents on the globe. On the continent alone, there are anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 different languages spoken across 54 different countries that are home to approximately 3,000 different tribes. This does not include the languages and dialects that have formed amongst the descendants of Africans in the Caribbean, Central and South America, and these United States. The truth is that the terror of colonialism and enslavement created a global culture of a global African diaspora that has even further diversified African people, making us a global nation of many tribes. Hear me. This means that it's easy for black people to believe that we have more differences between us than similarities. But see, the reality is that while we like to talk about whether or not you eat callaloo and I eat collard greens, and while you're running around talking about you like roti while I like rolls, and we keep trying to create this difference between us, the reality is that we are all being globally, systematically targeted for extermination and disenfranchisement for no other reason than our race and nationality. Regardless of if you speak patois or Creole, we're all in the same boat. The fact of the matter is, you just might have gotten dropped off before me. And the tragedy is that there aren't many willing to stand up and say, "For my people." There aren't many willing to declare the protection and preservation of black people based on our collective Africanness. Instead, we like to focus on our distinct blackness, finding that if there is an African that is facing destruction and extermination from a different tribe than us, it then becomes a fatality outside of our jurisdiction for justice. An issue that is none of my concern. What do I mean? See, African Americans are being falsely arrested, beaten, and even murdered by law enforcement, and Caribbeans are averting their eyes because African Americans are boisterous, uneducated criminals who need to be taught civility. Caribbean dreamers are being deported, and African Americans are averting their eyes because Caribbeans are ungrateful for all the work African Americans did to even allow them to immigrate to the U.S. in the first place. Oh, we gonna pretend today? Is that what we're gonna? The choir had me in the morning. We gonna pretend in the afternoon. I thought y'all was gonna be honest with me in the afternoon. Okay, that's fine. See, the reality is that we are all intentionally allowing injustice to happen to one another because we do not identify as one. But at some point, we've got to realize, like Esther, that exploitation in Haiti is just as important as gentrification in Harlem. We've got to understand that a travel ban on Nigeria is just as unjust as food deserts in New Orleans. We've got to understand that incarceration in Baltimore is just as unjust as illiteracy in Barbados. We've got to understand that hopelessness in Chicago is just as unjust as homelessness in Cape Verde. We've got to be willing to stand up and say, "For my people," and it includes Jews outside our Benjamite tribe. Because the fact of the matter is, we are all dispersed Africans, affected by the same decree, all affected by the reality that this nation is globally and systematically attempting to destroy us for no other reason than our race and nationality. We all need to heed the wisdom of Mordecai, where he says that for your silence in self-preservation, this will bring you nothing but destruction on your own house. Esther's declaration for my people shows us that her commitment to saving all of the Jews from every tribe, not just the Jews from her home of the tribe of Benjamin and not just the Jews residing in the palace courts, Queen Esther committed to delivering her entire nation from destruction because she found community and oneness in her Jewish identity as a whole. She understood that the call to save the Jews was not an exclusive call looking to bring salvation to some, a select few, a distinct population. No, the call for salvation was a call to all the Jews. This is further seen when Mordecai and Queen Esther get King Ahasuerus to agree to not just sign, but draft counter documents decreeing the Jews' protection. In chapter 8, beginning at verse 9, the Bible says, on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, this is the month Sivan, the royal scribes were summoned. Everything was written exactly as Mordecai commanded for the Jews to the satraps, the governors, and the officials of the 127 provinces from India to Cush. The edict was written for each province in its own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in King Ahasuerus' name and sealed the edicts with the royal signet ring. He sent the documents by mounted couriers who rode fast horses bred in the royal stables. The king's edict gave the Jews to each and every city the right to assemble and defend themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate every ethnic and provincial army hostile to them, including women and children, and to take their possessions as spoils of war. Verse 13, a copy of the text issued as law throughout every province was distributed to all the peoples so the Jews could be ready to avenge themselves against their enemies on that day. In other words, Esther did not just fight for salvation for every single Jew, but she and Mordecai made sure that their salvation was legally binding and distributed in their own language, because salvation does not require assimilation. Oh, saints, work with me. Salvation does not require assimilation. See, I don't know about you, but I feel like there is a black Christian expression that we have not tapped into because we are bound to a European expression of worship. Oh, they don't want to talk back to me today. That's all right. Because see, the reality is that God desires that you encounter and experience him in a way that is unique to your culture and experience. When I look in the Old Testament, I look at the story of Hagar. Hagar is sent away into the wilderness. Her and her son are dying. God comes to her and provides for her, says that he is going to give her and her son a promise. In that moment, Hagar identifies God as El Roi. She says and names him, this is the God who sees me. In other words, this Egyptian slave has had an encounter and an experience with God for herself, and instead of believing that Ra, the Egyptian God, is the God who sees, she has an encounter with the God who created the world, and she names him for herself. How many times are we going to continue to come into church, worship, and encounter God in ways that are unique to Europeans and not to us? How many times are we going to allow Persians to dictate how we come to God, what we name God, how we know God? At some point, we've got to say that I am black, I have had this experience, and this is how I know God. This is what I will call God. This is how I will worship God. I will not speak of him in the language that you have given me. I will speak of him in the language that he gave me. I will accept his salvation, and I will engage with that salvation in a language that is my own. A culture that is my own. In the story of Esther, Jews did not have to leave their tribe, move to a new land, and learn a new language in order to benefit from the salvation that she worked for on their behalf. Instead, Esther took it upon herself to notify them where they were, and in a way that they could receive that salvation has just been given to them freely. Now, what if we did the same thing? What if we worked to save young black girls from being sex trafficked? What if we worked to save young black boys from wrongful convictions? What if we worked to evangelize people in Africa and the Caribbean, and we did not force them to assimilate? We did not force them to dress like us. We did not force them to speak like us. We did not force them to do things as we do it here in America, but instead gave them the freedom and the spiritual authority to come to know and understand God in their own way. What if we tangibly showed people that you can accept salvation, and in receiving salvation, you are not required to assimilate to the person that has led you to salvation? This is an important lesson to learn from Esther, because her narrative also teaches us that when you declare "for my people," you are determining in your heart that structures and statutes won't stop you. See, after receiving Mordecai's wisdom, Queen Esther replied, "I will go to the king, even if it is against the law. If I perish, I perish." She uttered these words because during this time there was a law that you could only appear before the king if you were invited. If you were not invited, the king then needed to extend his royal scepter in order for you not to die. All right? This law was also something that Queen Esther had to abide by. And so knowing this, she says, you know what? I'm going to make a decision that even though I could die, I'm going to break this law. And how many of us are willing to go against the law to ensure someone else's freedom? How many of us are really willing in 2020 to break a law to ensure someone else's salvation? See, I'm thinking of the words of Dr. King in his famous A Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he says, one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. This is what we see Queen Esther demonstrating for us: the moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws due to the superseding moral responsibility to fight for the protection and preservation of her people. See, during Black History Month, we love talking about Harriet Tubman. We love romanticizing the work that she did. I feel like we don't even know Harriet because we keep thinking Harriet was running around from Maryland all the way down to Georgia. Harriet was not running from Maryland all the way down to Georgia and bringing slaves from Georgia back up here. Harriet was running between here and Pennsylvania. History, saints, all right? Harriet's running between here and Pennsylvania, saving the people, all right? But what we do not like to acknowledge is that this was illegal. Harriet was basically a thief running around stealing property. Property that did not belong to her. And during this time, the Fugitive Slave Act basically said that if you were a slave on a plantation and you ran away, you stole you. Listen, because you didn't belong to you. So you stole yourself from your master, and now you are a wanted thief who could die because you stole yourself. This woman dedicated her life, risked her life, breaking laws on a daily basis for the salvation of other people. But you know what's also great? Many of us don't know this. The Adventist church has a history of breaking unjust laws. See, I don't know if you've heard of this, but Thomas, I always get this wrong, Edson White. I always want to call him Thomas Edison. Edson White, Lord, Ellen White's son, got together with a team of people. They built a steamboat called the Morning Star Steamboat. During this time, they then sailed all across the southern states, particularly around Mississippi. Edson White, to be clear, and other white people took thousands of books in the Morning Star Steamboat and against federal law were teaching former slaves how to read and write. They had created the Gospel Primer and the Gospel Worker, two pamphlet documents that they were using to teach African Americans not just how to read and write, but about the salvation and the gospel of Jesus Christ. we have a history of breaking unjust laws, folks. And at some point, we've got to say to ourselves, in 2020, it is clear that there are some people who are sold to destruction, death, and extermination. And am I willing to break some unjust laws, to stand up against principles and powers of authority and declare for my people? The truth is, many of us struggle declaring for my people because many of us are still comfortable with the status quo. So much so that we allow the sins of injustice to creep into our workplaces, our schools, and even our churches. And we say absolutely nothing because we are afraid of termination. Termination from our jobs, termination from our families, termination from our departments. But when you truly believe in the mandate and responsibility of for my people, you believe that it is better to die demanding the love of God be seen in the earth than to live silently waiting for his physical return in the face of destruction. God is looking for a generation of believers that are willing to take up the mantle of our foremothers and say, for my people, mass incarceration will be a bondage of the past. For my people, illiteracy will be illegal. For my people, diabetes will be cured. For my people, food deserts will be filled with grocery stores. For my people, mental health will be normalized. For my people, debt will be paid off and familial wealth generated. For my people, girls will grow up knowing that you can be a preacher for justice, a strategist for justice, an organizer for justice, a fundraiser for justice, a cook for justice, a singer for justice, a teacher for justice, yea, even the face of social justice. And see, the beauty of the gospel is that we serve this amazing God who saw the condition of humanity. He saw us here on this earth, and he saw that we were ruled by this enemy who believed that it was his sole purpose to sell us to destruction, death, and extermination. He saw the decree that Satan drafted, and not only did Jesus waltz into Satan's court uninvited, but with every sting of each whiplash, Jesus said, for my people. With every gasp of air, Jesus said, for my people. With the throbbing of every broken bone, Jesus said, for my people. With a crown of thorns pressed on his head, Jesus said, for my people. With nails hammered in his hands, Jesus said, for my people. With a sword pierced in his side, Jesus said, for my people. With a body drenched in blood, Jesus said, for my people. By dying on the cross, Jesus perished so we don't have to. In fact, before Jesus died, he said in John 3:16 and 17, a verse that we love to quote. He said, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Church, it's time that we activate. We serve a God who came to save us so that we would not perish, to save not just us, but a dying world. A world that was sold to destruction, death, and extermination. And he said, for my people. He said, I will not let you perish. I will not let you die. But instead, I am going to take your place. I'm going to fight your fight. I don't know about you, but I'm ready for a church that is willing to break unjust laws. I'm ready for a church that is willing to say, for my people, a church that is willing to see that we are a human family in as much as we are one in our Africanness, we are also one with humanity across race, across nationality, across gender. At what point are we going to see the destruction and death of our people? Because we are people of God. And so we are looking and we are seeing that we are in the last days. We are seeing the decisions and the storms and every perilous time and every single thing that we like to claim and attach to every verse in Matthew 25. If we see the destruction and we see the death, at what point are we going to say, for my people? Salvation is available to all of the world. When are we going to partner with Christ, partner with God, and say, I am going to help save this world because they are both dying socially and spiritually? When we look at the example of Christ in the gospel, he was not simply coming down and forgiving sins. He was talking to women when he had no business. He was disrupting economic exploitation in the temple when he overturned all of them, made a whip, and started whipping all those people selling doves. We serve a God who cares about the things that we go through. He cares about the things that we are bound by. He cares that you were abused. He cares that you were wrongfully convicted. He cares that you are addicted to substances. He cares about the things that are seeking to exterminate you. Not just the spiritual sins that are trying to burn you in the end, but the things that are trying to destroy you now. That's the God that we serve.